Welcome. I'm Jessica Tejan, and this is the Evolving to Exceptional podcast, where we talk about reaching peak performance in our workplaces, homes, and communities so that we can live our best life possible, an exceptional life. Welcome, everybody, back to the Evolving to Exceptional podcast. I am healthy this week, and Meldina is struggling. So we will see how this goes, but you'll have to forgive any coughs or scratchiness in her voice this week, as you did mine last week. It just seems like it's a summer of colds. So we are so excited for this episode as part of our Evolving Workplaces series called The Truth of Transactions. I'm particularly excited or interested in this episode because it allowed me to use a little bit more of my legal background in talking about contracts and the different types of relationships or transactions that people get into. So for a long time, whichever party has more power, money, influence, size, they are the ones that are really positioned to get the greatest value out of any type of engagement or exchange of value. This includes the employee-employer relationship, business-to-customer relationships, and business-to-business or vendor relationships. Although in my research, much has been discussed in terms of shifting to a relational model versus a transactional model with customers, particularly in the services arena, very little has addressed the area of employee and employer. Furthermore, I'm not sure of the overall success in making the shift and trying to create more meaningful partnerships between businesses. So what do we know? What is it that we've seen, and what's this problem that we want to talk about today? Well, transactions are inherently based upon self-serving interests, which hinders the potential magnitude of the relationship rather than expanding it. And as businesses have grown more complex than this simple exchange of value, which is appropriate to a transactional relationship or a business exchange, this has created increased complexity. So to respond to this challenge, contracts have become increasingly complex, trying to outline the business relationship between two parties. As our interactions have become more complex, so have our agreements. In fact, we rarely transact one activity with our work then being completed, especially in the employee-employer relationships. These relationships are even more complex. Employees have always had less power than the employer in the relationship. As a result, employers can take advantage of employees. And we see this where those at the top are making 10x or more what those in the workplace are making. When the balance becomes too tipped, employees feel the negative effects of this transaction. Today, we will discuss the truth of transactions, including how business exchanges work, examples of transactional relationships, what is causing a shift towards more transactional relationships, and what are the issues with these transactional relationships. We hope to highlight some of the issues with transactional relationships, especially with employees, and why a shift to a more relational or transformational relationship might create greater results for everyone.
So Jessica, how does a business exchange or transaction typically work?
Oh, this is so fun. I get to play lawyer for a minute. Not really. Most people understand this, but business models are all based upon an exchange in value. One party provides something of value, a product or a service, to the other party in exchange for value. Typically, we use money as part of that exchange. The relationship between two parties is then characterized as a transaction. A transaction represents an exchange of value. A typical transactional relationship is based upon getting as much as one can in exchange for a set amount of work or an item. While there are cases where transactional relationships are not just needed, but they're required, the vast majority of business today is conducted in a way that is actually hindered by this transactional approach.
So in simple terms, I just want to make sure I understand and the viewers understand. It's basically, I will give you something of mine in exchange for that thing that I want from you, and I'll give you something so that I can get that in return. Is that a pretty fair summary?
Absolutely. And it's anytime that there's an exchange, when we think of transactional exchanges, we think of one-time exchanges in value. So think of going to the grocery store. It's a transaction. I am purchasing groceries and I'm going home. It's a one-time exchange. It's not an extended relationship.
What are some other examples of transactional relationships?
So as we look at these transactional relationships, we're looking at all of the relationships. So it's those that are exist with employees, with customers, and with vendors. And each is viewed as a separate party that's negotiating or choosing to exchange their products or services in exchange for the value returned, in exchange for money. Now, transactional relationships are typically, I'm going to give some either or here's. Transactional relationships are typically professional versus friendly. They are focused on self-interest rather than mutual interest. If you think about the grocery store example, there I'm focused on getting my groceries, the grocer is focused on getting their money. Each of us are just focused on what we're getting. They're focused on what you get rather than what you give. They have a stay in touch versus a keep informed model. They understand process versus understanding the person. You judge the results versus evaluating the relationship. Win conflicts versus resolving conflicts. It's a focus on agreements versus acceptance, and a focus on evaluating results versus evaluating how the other feels about the results. So you can really see the nuance there, I think, in those comparisons of where the model where I'm in it for myself and I'm going to negotiate for myself as much as I can, take as much as I can, get as much as I can, where I'm focused on what I'm going to get at the end versus a longer term relationship or a longer term connection that creates results and relationship rather than just the one-time transaction. Now, transactional relationships work well in situations where the sale is targeted at a large group of customers or a market, where there is a one-time engagement and then the relationship ends, like in this example of a grocery store, or if you're purchasing a one-time product. When you're selling a product that is purchased with no additional need of support. So when you're selling a widget, something that does not require technological support or use support, that is a good example of where a transaction is valuable. And situations where there's no need for a defined contract or written relationship. So like the grocery store example, a restaurant would be another one where you don't actually have to define the relationship because it's so simple that the exchange is able to be handled without the complexity of a contract or putting it into writing.
Now, Jessica, what about going to the doctor or getting your hair done at a salon or even having your car repaired? Are those also considered transactional relationships?
I think that it depends on the provider. I think it's a good question and a good example. I think a relationship with your doctor is most certainly not transactional. It's ongoing. You're coming back to the person. You care about what you get, although there are not contracts that dictate those relationships outside of maybe the insurance contracts, but certainly not between you as the patient and the doctor directly. An example of like a car mechanic or a hair salon, there's certainly an extended relationship, but there doesn't have to be. So it could be a transaction. I get someone new to cut my hair every single time I go, or it could be I develop these relationships and I do a good job and they want to keep coming back to me for my expertise, for the experience that they have overall.
So it really depends on that unique situation, whether it's transactional or not, if it's an ongoing relationship. What is happening that is causing a shift that we're seeing?
I think that there's a shift happening that is causing challenges in these relationships. So people are moving into the biggest gig economy we've ever seen. There are more people that are out there using what used to be a side hustle as their primary source of income, I think, than ever before. We've got the Uber model, DoorDash, we've got Fiverr, and more popping up as ways to earn in exchange for services. So we take Fiverr. For anybody who's not familiar, Fiverr is a platform that you can go onto and you can search for just about any service you want or need performed and buy it for a set price. So if I want someone to write an employee handbook for my small business, I can go on and pay someone who has that expertise or skill set to do that. If I need marketing materials, I can pay for that. If I need administrative support, I can pay for that. There are a surprising number of varying options that are available for purchase. These prices vary significantly based on the type of service, where the service provider is located. There are individuals that perform these services all over the world and the skills that are needed. I'll take the employee handbook, for example. One person with a lot of expertise in the United States who understands the laws here, they may charge one amount, and someone located elsewhere may charge a much lower amount. Anyone can price what they're selling at any amount they want. And this creates a really interesting challenge for employers. If a person can sell their skill set on their own to do the activity an employer would normally pay them for, and they can do it for more money, more flexibility, and more life satisfaction, there's very little to entice them back to a full-time traditional employer.
I think another place where we've seen that also is on Etsy, where we saw people opening shops and can create just about anything and provide both products and services. So I remember at the start of COVID when we had mask shortages, I saw so many people start making masks from scratch. I mean, never did they ever think that they would start this, but they learned how to do it and then they opened up their Etsy shops. Just saw it as kind of an extra, a way to make some extra money to supplement their income. And they saw how much they were getting from that, that they were like rethinking their whole, do I really need to be working for this large employer? Can I just do this on my own? So I think we're seeing it all over the place.
I love Etsy as an example because it is such a great example of where, especially for creatives and producers of unique goods, that they have the opportunity to produce and sell those without having to establish a big business organization behind it in order to do so. And so, yeah, you can also on Etsy buy just about anything from templates to cookies to t-shirts. You can get these very customized, unique goods through that platform, through what they have to sell. And I believe this is where the vast majority of people who've entered the quote unquote great resignation or the great reset, whatever you want to call it, have gone. They are actually working. They're just not working where and in the way that they would have in the past. They found new ways to be able to earn the money that they need doing things that are more interesting, enjoyable, and create the life experience that they want to be having.
And why do you think that happened? Why have people left the traditional, I'll say that with air quotes, workplaces to sell their skills on their own?
So I think people realized that they were being treated transactionally by the employer to their employer's benefit, and they decided they wanted more for themselves. Why be forced to come to an office, work long hours if you can do the same work on your own and keep more of the money? If people didn't feel connected to the purpose and the people in their workplace, why would they stay? And I think that's a really key piece of it. And we're going to talk in some other episodes about purpose and about the connections between people. But if people don't feel one of those two things, if they're not passionate about what they're doing and they don't have connections or relationships with the people in their workplace, that it makes it an easy decision to choose to leave and do something else, do something that they will enjoy more. And I think that this shift is going to continue. I think only those workplaces who see the challenges with the transactional relationship with employees and customers and create a new approach will be able to entice them in the future. There's a lot of talk right now about inflation, the market, what's going to happen next. And no one really knows for sure. Our best predictor is history. And so there's a lot of predictions about a recession. Maybe we're already in a recession and we don't know it. There's all this speculation. I think that when we look at the pop-up startups and businesses that are being created in response to a traditional model that's no longer sought, that's no longer valued by most people, it may still be successful in the marketplace. These businesses are not collapsing today, right? But they are no longer sought after, no longer what employees want in their careers. That unless the workplaces make this shift, they are going to experience continued decline of people leaving their organizations in order to find more transformational relationships rather than transactional.
So, Jessica, we're making the argument that transactional relationships aren't necessarily the most effective type of relationships for businesses. Can you tell us a little bit about what are some of the issues with a transactional relationship?
Yes, but I want to clarify that too, that there are places for transactional relationships. It is best that I can still go buy McDonald's for my kids on Friday night. Today is Friday, and my kids get McDonald's on Friday, and they get to buy that. There's no contract, there's no, lasting relationship there. It doesn't have to be a transformational experience because I just want to get them chicken nuggets and fries and strawberry banana smoothies, right? There are places for transactional relationships. I think, especially when it comes between business and customer, when it's in those types of relationships. But when we go a level up, when we go a level to knowledge workers and we think about the relationship between the employee and the employer, and between service provider and business, so be in the B2B and the business to business space, I think there's a lot of power in having transformational relationships, in having relationships that allow more in-depth communication and connection to create greater results. And so we're going to talk about both of those a little bit, but I really am focused in the employee and employer relationship. And in any situation where one party has superiority or power over another party, it creates a challenge in the transactional relationship. So again, if we go back to those examples where I'm saying it works to have transactions, the relationship works because I don't need more power than to just get the chicken nuggets, right? I don't need more, I want it to be warm. There's certain quality standards there, but I don't need more than that. I don't need follow up. I don't need more touch points. I don't need more explanations. I don't need more than that transaction. So it's a fairly balanced power, it's a fairly balanced power dynamic. But when it comes to the employee employer relationship, it's a very complex power dynamic. And so the first problem that I see with these transactional relationships is the more complex the relationship is, the more difficult it is to create the contracts or the agreements to manage them. Now, contracts exist to clarify terms between different parties in order to create clarity between the parties, so the parties know what happens in different situations. When there's more complexity than in a simple purchase, like buying the meal, agreements are created to clarify the important elements of the arrangements. These agreements, by creating clarity of what happens in various situations, should increase satisfaction. But clarity of expectations is an unpredictable world. In an unpredictable world is incredibly challenging and almost never can be accomplished at once in the beginning of a new relationship. So even in traditional relationships that have existed for a long time, with the changes in the market where we've had significant supply chain issues in the marketplace with not being able to get the raw materials needed to make other types of materials, which has caused all kinds of backup in so many different industries. It's been a real challenge. Nobody, when they created their relationship or their initial contract, could have foreseen those types of issues occurring in the ways that they did, which meant that the contract didn't account in a lot of instances for those situations. Even most contracts did not actually include pandemic in its list of force majeure, which is a clause about acts of God or situations that occur that allow you time to respond to contract terms. But pandemic wasn't even included in that. And so workplaces are having to respond and make changes to agreements that they had already put in place because of these unpredictable conditions in the world of things that are happening. So the more complex the value exchange, particularly in terms of professional services being provided, the more difficult the contract is to draft, which is one of the reasons why historically professional services like attorneys are billed at hourly rates rather than a defined scope. You can't really know what it's going to take to perform all of those services. So it's more manageable to just create an hourly rate and have to really track your time and make sure you're using your time effectively rather than defining a scope and pricing out a lump sum agreement. Now, the challenge comes because people want to know what they're buying and see the value that they're getting. As our businesses become more complex in terms of exchanging ideas, innovation, and technology, these agreements become increasingly important. I've even seen the pop up of, and you probably have too, of value or results based contracts where the vendor or provider gets paid based on the results of the customer. I've actually just entered into one of my first contracts, evolving to exceptional has to do this type of contract where you get a percentage of the results that you create. And so we really have to, in response to this, we really have to craft clarity in the how we're going to operate more than in the what is going to be delivered, as the result or outcome often changes. Now, how will the parties work together to define and determine the value? How will they create this? That is all part of the challenge.
I've got a good recent example of this. So we just had the sprinkler guys come out to do an irrigation startup for us right after winter, which seemed pretty simple, right? Very transactional, we signed off on a contract and figured, it was going to be one and done. And when they came out to do the service, they realized that the fence guys who had just been there weeks prior busted one of the lines that they were in while they were installing our fence, which meant that this was going to be a whole new scope. So they sent out another guy, of course, to fix the busted pipe. So now we're like 2 weeks into this, and he discovers that there's another issue with the lateral line and that they're going to have to come back out to look at it. So now we're pushed out again 2 more weeks. And when we went to go look back at the contract we had signed for them to come out and take a look at that first time to see whether or not those additional services were covered, we realized that that contract didn't have all the answers that we were looking for, which made it a lot more difficult and such a painful experience for us.
I love that example. I love that.
So then, Jessica, in terms of employee relationships, what's the problem there? What's the issue with them being so complex?
So I think these are even more interesting that we've seen these become so complex in terms of what employees are expecting of their employers. It's really shifted dramatically. So they're now expecting things like social activism, responding to social issues like social justice, racism, harassment, responding to the recent Roe v. Wade and supporting women's rights. They're really expecting their employers to take a stance and stand up for what they believe in. They are wanting employers to really focus on the environment and the environmental effects that they're having. And there's a higher level of a desire for a higher level of employee support services to really enhance their life, not just their work experiences. And, to date, most employees, different states have different practices here, but most employees are at will unless they're part of a union contract, which means that they are not getting to dictate terms or contract terms with their employer. And that also means that they don't get to determine or have influence on what the culture or environment or policies of their workplace will be. Instead, they have to choose wisely when they make a decision to go to work somewhere. And that's actually causing people to move jobs far more frequently than they ever have before. If the culture sucks, if the culture isn't good, they're not going to stick it out. Instead, they're just going to look for somewhere better. There's this life is short, why waste it in a bad work environment mentality. And this is giving employers little time to remedy issues before employees take action. So employees are actually leaving. I've heard examples of people taking a job, leaving before they even start the job in some cases. In other cases, maybe they've been on the job a week or two and they get another offer that will provide them remote work, whereas this one will not. And they quit the job and say, I'm sorry, that's more important to me. I'm leaving. And so there's not this, I think the older mentality or the historical mentality is if I accepted a job, I should stick it out for a while and see how it goes and, not look like I've moved around a bunch on my resume. And what I'm seeing is the opposite right now. People don't care. They're happy to go into an employer and say, I've moved around a lot because I wanted to find the best place for me. And these other places were not the best place for me. And that is why I'm here today, and help me understand why you are the best place for me. And it's not an arrogance. Instead, it's more about personal awareness and self-awareness of what they need and what they want in their lives and applying that into the workplace. And so I think that's really causes challenges if you're looking at the employee relationship as a transactional relationship, because they will just leave. They'll just walk away.
Absolutely. And I think we've seen some businesses try to respond to this changing of employee needs with mental health days. I've seen that has been an increased benefit also with acts of service days, right? Where you can take the day off and volunteer and give back to your community to try to combat those issues that employees are raising with their employers. And Jessica, you brought up a good point. I think we're seeing also a shift in where your loyalty kind of lies. So initially, I think once you're offered, or historically, when you were offered a job, you felt that sense of loyalty to that employer almost immediately, right? You were not going to entertain any other offers. It was going to be that offer. You accepted it. You were going to go and work there no matter what. But now it seems like we're seeing kind of a shift to you're being loyal to yourself and what you really want and what's going to make you the happiest, the most successful, and the most engaged.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
What other problems are there with transactional relationships?
So I think transactions create, and this is in any type of contract, they create liability, price, and quality issues. So, when you are dealing with a longer term relationship, but treating it as a transaction, there's a challenge with liability in terms of who is responsible when something goes wrong. Everyone in any contract negotiation is always trying to take the least amount of responsibility. So when you don't know how the arrangement's going to progress, it's hard to determine the risk. When there's a dispute, how will it be resolved? And so these types of liability issues come up when we're trying to, handle more complex agreements as transactions. Another is price issues. So whoever needs the other party more is going to determine the price. Trying to determine value is always a subjective and difficult task. So right now we see this in even bigger terms with inflation. The prices of everyday items have skyrocketed, gas, groceries, etc., in response to the market conditions. Just look at the housing market. With demand high, houses are selling way above the value they would have held a few years ago. And so this creates a challenge with determining what the price is going to be now versus later as you're negotiating contracts or trying to negotiate and agree on price in different industries that these pricing fluctuations are having such an impact. And then when you think about it from an employee perspective, employees almost always get bigger increases when they switch jobs, when they move from one company to another. And they really have very little room to negotiate their value after being hired. It can become really difficult for employees to convince their employees of their employers of their value, to negotiate what they could have gotten if they were to move positions. And then the
So
last is quality issues. So, how is it decided what the quality result is when at the beginning, rarely is all the information available? So, with the speed of change in technology, services, and business in general, everything is changing so fast that knowing what is needed at the outset is even more difficult than ever before, which means quality can be a challenge when you're limited to an additional budget, scope, or price. And you learn a lot during a relationship that's going to impact what you'll accept later on. And so, again, from the employee perspective, it's hard to know what the culture really will be when you're hired, what expectations will truly be in the job from just a job description and an interview. And so, although the job may have been presented one way when you were hired, it may not end up truly being that description or unfolding in the way that you anticipated when you agreed to the contract price or to your salary price when you were hired at the time.
I think that's such an important issue to bring up because I've heard it time and time again in exit interviews when someone has made the decision to leave. When we ask the question, did the expectations for the job meet your expectations of what you originally anticipated the job would look like? And so many times I've heard, in a nutshell, yes, but I had so many other things that I was responsible for that I had no idea. And had I known that, I probably wouldn't have taken this job because it is just so far from what I wanted to do or like to do. So that is definitely an issue that I can see coming up more and more, especially with how fast things are changing in the employee-employer relationships today.
Absolutely. So the last problem with transactions is that they ignore the value created before the relationship and initial exchange. and they struggle to keep up with relationships that are ongoing. So when we learn to accept money for something we do, we learn that the doing is the reason for the money, meaning the action or the activity itself. And this discounts all that occurred to make it possible to do that activity well or provide that product successfully. So that's the experience, the skills, the capabilities, and research that went into the creation of the exchange. So an example of this is that everybody can write, but not everyone can write well. Not everyone has the experience and the skills and the capabilities to actually do so at the highest level. And who we enter into agreements with dramatically impacts the outcome and satisfaction of the result. So the same applies to employees. Who they are will have a big impact on the value they bring. I'm going to say that again. Who you choose to hire will have a very big impact on the value that those individuals are able to bring to your business. And you can't be sure of that until you've actually worked with them. You can't be sure of what they can actually provide you until they've been there and been in the role for a while. So ideally, we want to establish longer term relationships. We don't have to keep guessing who to hire when we buy services or hire employees. We want employees to say recruiting and hiring is costly and difficult. But the problem is that the initial engagement, if treated as a transaction, often defines the balance of the relationship. And so many things change throughout that relationship.
What are some examples of this?
So, for example, when you hire services from someone or a business, you must negotiate the terms of the contract, but the type of services, scope of services, length of the engagement may dramatically change the nature of the relationship down the line. Therefore, you're forced to negotiate a contract that may or may not take into consideration, and likely not, all the changes that are likely to occur in the future. And we also don't want to be constantly negotiating contract agreements. I've done this, and I know from experience just about everyone, and especially me, hates negotiating contracts. So I don't want to keep negotiating. I want to get a contract in place so that I can focus on what we're delivering. But it is really hard to define the terms of a contract in an environment where things are changing so significantly.
What about for employees? What's an example of this?
Yeah, so another example with employees get to negotiate when they're first hired. They can negotiate their salary, their benefits, their job description, but after being hired, they're essentially at the whim of the workplace. They rarely get a chance to negotiate again and never have the leverage back unless they threaten to leave with an alternative offer. And that is such a terrible method for ensuring mutual satisfaction and mutual beneficial outcomes. Essentially, employees are left with the only choice to be, their only choice to be to vote or choose with their feet by leaving to a new employer, or arguably the alternative is to form unions, which brings in another set of challenges as well. All these examples create challenges to establishing long-term, long-lasting relationships that generate positive results for both parties.
I actually just had a friend go through this same issue, and they ultimately decided that the relationship was no longer mutually beneficial. And so they just found another job that gave them a really nice salary boost. So it was a win-win kind of for them. But I mean, I could see from an employee standpoint, if I'm working at a company for X amount of years and someone new comes in and they're getting paid the same amount as I am, what's motivating me outside of obviously compensation? What's motivating me to keep doing my job and to keep doing it well? Employees are starting to see that these relationships need to be ongoing and that it can't be just transactional. We negotiate at the very beginning when you hire me, but then 10 years down the road, there's not very much room for a negotiation.
And a lot changes. A lot
Absolutely.
changes. You change roles, you develop, you grow, the company changes, the company grows and develops. And so you really have to begin to think, is there another way? Wouldn't it be nice if there was another way? And, we believe that there is, and that by creating transformational relationships that are based on shared agreements of how we're going to operate rather than what we're doing, we can create outcomes that optimize and advance the goals of all the parties. And we acknowledge that this model is not going to work in all situations for all workplaces, But especially for those workplaces that are struggling to keep employees or develop lasting partnerships with customers and vendors, this model might be something to consider. Looking at creating these transformational relationships based upon shared agreements that optimize to advance the goals of all the parties. And so, really moving from a transactional model to a relational or transformational model in terms of business relationships. So, we will be back in a future episode to talk about what that transformational relationship model and shared agreement model might look like. We are so happy that you were here with us today on this latest episode. I do want to use this opportunity to share that my newest book, Fiercely Cherished Beings, is going to be published next month, but will be available for pre-sale starting this week. So make sure if you want to go grab an e-copy of my book, Fiercely Cherished Beings, it will be available for pre-sale on Amazon. And the first chapter of my new book will be available for free. And I will include that link. It'll be on my website, but it'll also be in the show notes so that you can go grab that book. It is a phenomenal book. I'm super excited to share it with the world. So take this opportunity to go check it out, get that first chapter for free. And if you're interested, go order the ebook as part of the pre-sales.
I've
So
already read it, so I highly recommend, and I think it is a great read for all of our listeners out there. Make sure to take advantage of the free chapter and also to pre-order the book. You definitely don't want to miss that opportunity.
thank you, Meldine. I appreciate that vote of confidence. As any author, we're always nervous when we go to publish our book. So I hope you all have a wonderful week, and remember to always keep evolving.